recent years, in the context of the negotiations for the final peace agreement between the FARC and the outgoing government of Juan Manuel Santos, something that we've seen in Colombia, probably starting in around 2014, is a spike in the targeted killings of social movement activists, community movement activists, primarily those in rural areas. Once the peace process advanced and the final agreement was signed in November 2016, an area that has been targeted is also those rural areas where the FARC demobilized. So those peasant communities, those rural communities are being targeted. Those areas are being targeted in other areas as well. So this vigil for peace was called in Colombia by the left Colombia Humana movement, led by Gustavo Petro, but it's not just a Colombia Humana initiative. He called it because today is the day that the new president in Colombia, he's a right-wing leader, Iván Duque of the Central Democratic Center Party. He won the presidential elections in May 2018. He got over 10 million votes, and the Colombia Humana movement, left movement, led by Gustavo Petro, got over 8 million votes. It's the highest number of votes that the left, the legal left, parliamentary left, has ever gotten in Colombia. So so the Colombia Humana movement and Gustavo Petro said on August 7th, when the new president is taking over, we're going to mobilize across the country and ask people to mobilize internationally to demand an end. Well, the focus is demanding an end to these killings, that those that are responsible will be punished, dismantling paramilitary groups that still exist throughout the countryside in these areas. And also the other key demand was to support the implementation of the peace agreement. So something that distinguishes the new government led by Iván Duque and the opposition, the left progressive opposition, including the Colombia Humana movement led by Gustavo Petro, is that the progressive left opposition support the full implementation of the peace agreement. So the peace agreement was signed in 2016 after about 4 years of negotiations in Havana. The FARC were the largest guerrilla movement army in Latin America and in the world, I believe, and the oldest one. It was an arduous negotiation, and it led to the demobilization of maybe 7,000 or so FARC combatants and militants. An agreement that they would be able to, that the rank and file combatants would get an amnesty, but the leadership would have to go to the Transitional Justice System Tribunal and answer to crimes that they have committed. And in exchange for truth around crimes and assuming responsibility, they would get an alternative sentence, right? So this accord contemplated a transitional justice tribunal, which initially was supposed to be for FARC leaders, army leaders, police, and it also included non-state, non-FARC, non-military, non-police actors, like let's say business people that were associated, financed one of the armed actors, leading to crimes against the population. So this Jurisdicción Especial de Paz, or Special Jurisdiction for Peace, which is part of the peace agreement, was supposed to be for all. So you could be called to testify, or you could voluntarily. For example, there's a lot of military, high-level military people that have been sentenced for crimes, human rights violations, through the ordinary justice system. So with this HEP, this tribunal, they could say, I want to come to the HEP, I want to tell my truth of what I know, to clarify the historical record so that this doesn't happen again, and in exchange also get an alternative system. So transitional justice system, the focus is clearing up the historical truth so that the victims know what happened, we know who's responsible, state and non-state, and that the society takes consciousness of this was never repeated again, right? There was also, the FARC were given designated seats in the Congress and in the Senate. The right wing and the government in power now was very much opposed to that. They don't feel that, despite the peace agreement, they don't think that the FARC despite demobilizing and all that, should be participating in the parliamentary institutions in the country. There was also some limited agrarian reforms, particularly in conflict areas where the FARC were active. One of the sources of the armed conflict in Colombia, the historical sources or the root causes, is lack of land for rural communities, unable to, even though maybe 30% of the population is rural, the armed conflict has centered itself in rural areas, always related to land. There's never been land reform in Colombia. One of the only countries, if not the only country in Latin America, that has never had land reform. So there was some very moderate reforms, agrarian reforms, where access, where the state can buy lands that are not being used, give them to these communities, give them money for credit, so that they could have an alternative to because people join these armed groups, FARC and others, for various reasons, including because it's a job and it protects you, you know what I mean? So alternatives in the agrarian sector. There's also a program to try to get communities that have no other option but to grow coca leaf that then is transformed into cocaine for the drug trade, like a program of voluntary crop substitution. So that's part of it. There's going to be a truth commission that doesn't, unlike the HEP or the Tribunal, it doesn't have an investigative, or it doesn't prosecute. It's like the truth commission in what happened in South Africa. You come to it and you give testimony. So if you were, let's say, a high-level army person, or let's say you were a businessman that financed right-wing paramilitaries, you would go to it and you would tell what you know, and the idea is that we know, you know the truth about what happened, right? So that's going to be in place. So one of the things that is at stake in the coming years, you have a right-wing government, far right-wing. The power behind the president is Álvaro Uribe, who was president for almost a decade in the 2000s, very opposed to the peace process, considered the most powerful person in Colombia politically. So that government's in power. He's a senator, they're opposed to the implementation of the peace accord. All these issues that I've said, especially a lot of it around the transitional justice system, they don't want the FARC to have any participation. And then you have this opposition that is 8 million votes, which in a country where one of the reasons, not the only reason, that there's been armed movements, even though I mentioned the structural issues, rural areas, has also been that for generations a lot of people have felt that there's no guarantee, right, to get engaged in legal political activism, and the stats are there. A lot of people have been killed. But now you see this opposition that is center left. Well, it's left and center left because it's a bit of a bloc, but they're progressive on a lot of different issues on climate change. They support the peace accord, supporting universal access to education, improved healthcare. So they got a lot of votes, which reflects that even though Colombian society is considered very right-wing, that people are disengaged. They don't, because a lot of the people who live in the cities don't care about the conflict in rural areas. In the second round of the presidential election in May, a lot of people came out and voted. So we know that the debate in Parliament is going to be very vigorous on all these issues. There's an anti-corruption initiative that's happening as well. That's a big issue, as you know, everywhere in Latin America, right? State officials are engaged in corruption, and it's systemic. In Colombia, they call it the marmalade. You get smeared with it because it's sticky and it's yummy, and you take it. So there's a lot of big debates and issues that are happening. The issue with the social movements is that we have to, there is a sense that because the peace accord was signed, that somehow Colombia is in a post-conflict context. Is not the truth. The FARC demobilized. It's true. They're a party now. There's still another armed group, guerrilla movement, was formed around the same time, the ELN, that's now engaged in its own peace process. And then you have a proliferation of armed groups that are mostly delinquent groups involved in organized crime, but are also engaged in this counterinsurgency, right? So, for example, if I'm a group engaged in the drug trade in a rural area, so the FARC demobilized, my group steps in, fills in the vacuum. I'm engaged in the drug trade. It's big money. And those peasants they want to participate in that program in the peace accord that says they want to replace planting coca that is produced for cocaine with legal crops. Like, that goes against my interest. So I'm going to make sure that they don't do it, which means people get murdered, people get targeted. So these initiatives, community and social movement initiatives, particularly in the rural areas, for indigenous movements that are trying to exercise the self-determination, Afro-Colombian communities, even though the FARC demobilized, there's still a lot of armed groups, armed violence, and armed conflict. So it's important to kind of bring back the attention that this has to stop, right? You can't, maybe in the mid '80s, because we say, oh, it's been happening forever. Yeah, this happened in the mid '80s, but we have a peace accord. Like, they can't continue. The Colombian government we have to pressure the Colombian government in Colombia and internationally that they have to put an end to these killings, and they have to dismantle those armed groups that are doing this. And we also believe that, because these are all militarized areas where the army is in, so you can't do this stuff without some complicity. So we know that not only do these groups have to be dismantled, but any links between them and state security forces of the regions have to be severed, and those people have to be punished. So, I think la luta continúa in Colombia. I mean, people are mobilizing, especially not only in the rural areas, in the urban areas as well. There is, as I said, a wave of persecution and repression, particularly in those areas where the FARC are no longer there. So other groups have come in, and war in Colombia, like anywhere else, means big money. Because when you're engaged in war and all the criminal activities, you make money. So people want to make money. So that's the struggle that we're facing. We think it's a dynamic situation. I mentioned the parliamentary election scenario. There's going to be a lot of stuff that's going to happen. These organizations are moving, and we're hoping that, for example, the parliamentary left in Colombia, or the left in Colombia, maybe because of the war, it's always been very divided, very sectarian. We're hoping that in the next phase, the next few years, that that the left in all its expressions is able to be a little more united, so that it can make some, even if we don't make drastic changes in the next few years, but at least significant reforms. If we could get to a political environment where social movements, grassroots social movements, can demonstrate, assemble, organize, and they're not murdered, where being murdered is the exception, not the norm, that would be a great gain for Colombian quote-unquote democracy, right?
And you think this is the pressure, as you said, there's national demonstrations in Colombia today?
Today, yeah, there was another set of similar vigils that happened, I think it was in February or March. Again, because this issue of the attacks on social movement leaders is now on the agenda, and this is kind of a bit of a marked difference. People talk about back in the mid '80s when the Patriotic Union and people were being murdered, right? Something that has changed now, which is interesting. Everybody, even the president and his party, if you were to ask them, what do you think about the murder of these social movements? Oh yeah, this got to stop. It's wrong. So there's been a shift in people, this issue has come to the foreground, and broad-based sectors in the country that maybe didn't express so before, not just the left or the progressive left or the activists are saying, this has got to stop. It's got to end, right? So there is a space where I think we can pressure more on this issue. And the other thing is, the current government that just took power today in Colombia, they are against the peace process. So the Canadian government on paper supported that agreement. They have given funds for projects related to peace initiatives, helping women and all that kind of stuff. So we have to advocate with the Canadian government, you have to focus your attention on these are over 300 killings since November 2016, and they keep happening, and they're not being stopped. So we think it's important. We think there's some opportunities to mobilize around this issue. We think it's a challenge.
And just last question, but you think the level and the communication and solidarity in South America, and even for other big social movements in South America, as helping applying this pressure on the Colombian and the new Colombian government to make sure that the peace agreement is put in fact in place? And
I think more is needed. I think generally speaking, especially progressive social movements in the region support the peace process. The problem is not, if you ask right-wingers, some of them support the peace process. The issue is its implementation, right? The thing is, it was signed, right? But now you have, like the things that I mentioned, the transitional justice system, which Colombia is one of those countries that has a history of a lot of egregious crimes being committed against civilians primarily in the context of the armed conflict for decades. We've never as a society, especially those Colombians that live there, have never kind of collectively kind of acknowledged that, where they, because, right now, majority of the people live in the cities, they don't live in the countryside. So a lot of people your age, people that are maybe younger, they've never lived the armed, they're not from the countryside. They're not they're not indigenous or Afro-Colombian or a peasant. They're not in an area where the FARC demobilized or where there is paramilitary groups. There may be people in the cities that have had family members killed or disappeared, but the collective trauma of displacement, right, of having a massacre being committed by right-wing paramilitaries or aggressions from the guerrillas as well, that's something that a majority of Colombians still haven't acknowledged, right? So that's why the Truth Commission is one component, and the HEP, or the Jurisdicción Especial de Paz, would be a chance to investigate, right? Because the narrative in Colombia is that the majority of the crimes committed by the FARC and the terrorists, which is similar narrative in different parts of the world. They committed a lot of crimes, for sure, undoubtedly, and the evidence is there. But we also have to look at what was the role of state, right? What was the role of links between state and right-wing paramilitaries? Civilian, politicians, elected officials. Why has the justice system in Colombia always been unable to punish really these crimes? So those are the things that we have to deal with, and that's what we think the government in power and the right-wing, they don't want to open up that can of worms, because they're going to have to answer. Because it's easy to keep saying, okay, it's the FARC, it's the FARC, okay? They got the guns. When they wanted to sign the agreement, no, they're not going to put down the guns. But they put down the guns, right? They put down the guns, right? So now it's, they don't, we don't want them in the parliament. So everybody says, well, every peace process, the guerrillas that sign the peace accord end up involved in politics one way or another. In the end, let the people decide. If the FARC can advance as a political party, because they can communicate with the population in an effective way, then that'll be determined by the people. But that's a component of the agreement.